Battle of Waterloo, Belgium, June 18th, 1815. 50,000 men died at Waterloo, but one refused to stay dead. Through the smoke and rain, his headless body still rides, blade dripping red, hunting for what was taken from him. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale that proves some soldiers never surrender, not even to death itself. In this blood-soaked field of glory, the most terrifying enemy is the one who cannot die. The rain-soaked fields of Waterloo stretched endlessly before Captain Jonathan Harrow of the King's German Legion, a career soldier who had left behind a young wife and infant son in Hampshire to answer Wellington's urgent call. June 18th, 1815 marked the culmination of 23 years of near-continuous warfare that had bled Europe white. As thunder rolled across the Belgian countryside, over 170,000 men prepared to decide the fate of an empire. Harrow touched the locket containing his family's miniature portrait, wondering if he would live to see them again. The morning had dawned gray and sodden, the previous night's downpour turning the battlefield into a treacherous quagmire. Napoleon's grand assault had been delayed for hours, waiting for the ground to dry enough for his beloved artillery to maneuver. This delay would prove costly for the French, though not in the way military historians would later record. Harrow stood with his cavalry unit, watching the great battle unfold through his spyglass. The air was thick with gunsmoke and the acrid smell of thousands of powder charges. Through the haze, he could make out the distinctive brass helmets and blue uniforms of the French heavy cavalry, the fearsome Cuirassiers forming up for another charge. Something was different about this attack. Even from this distance, Harrow could sense it. The French horsemen moved with an unnatural precision, their formations too perfect for the chaos of battle. At their head rode an officer whose posture seemed oddly rigid, his sword raised high despite the exhaustion that must have plagued both horse and rider after hours of combat. As the French cavalry began their advance, a stray cannonball screamed through their ranks. Harrow watched in horror as it struck the lead officer squarely in the neck. The impact should have thrown him from his saddle, should have ended his charge in a spray of blood and shattered bone. Instead, the headless body remained mounted, sword still raised, continuing to lead the attack as if nothing had happened. Harrow lowered his spyglass, convinced the smoke and stress of battle were playing tricks on his mind. But when he raised it again, the impossible sight remained. The headless officer rode on, his horses' hoofs throwing up clods of mud as they thundered toward the British lines. Behind him, his own men seemed oblivious to their commander's condition, following his lead with the same mechanical precision. "God help us all," Harrow whispered, as he prepared to meet this impossible charge. The order to countercharge came swift and sharp. Harrow drew his saber, its polished steel catching the gray light as he led his men forward. The ground thundered beneath hundreds of hooves as the two cavalry forces rushed to meet in the churning mud of no man's land. Time seemed to slow as they closed the distance. Through the gunsmoke, Harrow could now see details that his mind refused to accept. The French officer's cuirass bore a distinctive dent just below the collar, its edges dark with something that wasn't rust. Where his head should have been, there was only a ragged stump, yet his spine remained perfectly straight in the saddle. Most disturbing of all was the way his sword arm moved not with the wild flailing of a dead man's spasms, but with the practiced precision of a master swordsman. "Hold the line," Harrow shouted, his voice nearly lost in the cacophony of battle. His men wavered, their horses sensing their riders' fear. A young cornet to his right began to pray in German, the words tumbling out between chattering teeth. The distance closed to 50 yards. 30, 20. Fire. Musket balls tore through the air. Harrow watched in horror as they passed through the headless officer's body, leaving no mark. The phantom rider didn't even flinch, continuing his inexorable advance. 10 yards. The clash of steel on steel rang out as the two forces met. Harrow's saber passed through where the officer's neck should have been, encountering no resistance. The headless rider's blade, however, proved terrifyingly solid. It caught the shoulder of Harrow's uniform, slicing through wool and flesh with impossible precision. In the chaos of the melee, a Prussian infantry sergeant named Weber fought his way to Harrow's side. His face was ash white, his eyes wide with recognition and terror. "I saw him fall," Weber shouted in accented English, parrying a French cavalry sword. 2 hours ago, by the sunken road, Cannonball took his head clean off. I watched it roll into a drainage ditch. He crossed himself. He should not ride. Mother of God, he should not ride. The battle swirled around them, but Harrow could focus only on the headless officer. The rider wheeled his horse around for another pass, his movements flowing with an unnatural grace. The air grew thick with an oppressive cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Another volley of musket fire erupted. This time, Harrow clearly saw the balls pass through the rider's torso, rippling the air like stones thrown into a pond. Yet the officer remained mounted, his sword claiming lives with each pass. As the sun began to set on the blood-soaked field of Waterloo, Harrow realized with growing dread that they faced something beyond the realm of normal warfare. The French army might be retreating, but this one rider showed no sign of surrender. In the gathering darkness, his outline seemed to blur and shift, as if death itself had taken the form of a cavalryman to reap its harvest. In the aftermath of the battle, as surgeons tended the wounded and burial details began their grim work, Harrow found himself in the British command tent, attempting to make sense of what he'd witnessed. His shoulder wound throbbed beneath fresh bandages as he recorded his report, but the physical pain paled against the mental anguish of confronting something that shouldn't exist. A French prisoner was brought in for questioning a cavalry lieutenant named Marcel Dubois, his once pristine uniform caked with mud and worse. His left arm hung useless in a makeshift sling, but it was his eyes that caught Harrow's attention. They held the haunted look of a man who'd seen too much. At 26, Dubois was the youngest of 3 brothers. The middle one had fallen at Leipzig 2 years prior, and now Henry, the eldest, had met his own impossible fate. The lieutenant had promised their dying mother he would bring both brothers home safely, a vow now twisted into something nightmarish. "Le Capitaine Dubois," the lieutenant whispered, his good hand trembling as he accepted a cup of water. "My brother," he commanded the 4th Cuirassiers' 2nd Squadron. He swallowed hard. "I saw him fall. I was there, riding at his side when the English guns opened up. The ball, it took his head, just like that. But then," the lieutenant's voice cracked. He set down the cup, water sloshing over its rim. He stood back up. His body, it just stood back up. Mounted his horse like nothing had happened. And then he led the charge again. My own brother, riding without his head. Harrow's quill scratched across the paper as he documented every detail. Where did this happen? The exact location? By the sunken road, near the farm of La Haye Saint. I can show you where he fell. The lieutenant paused, his face growing even paler. But you won't find his head. We searched. Some of the men said they saw it roll into a drainage ditch, but he crossed himself. The water ran red that day, so much red. As night fell, Harrow led a small party to the location. The battlefield was eerily quiet now, save for the occasional moan of the wounded and the distant crackle of campfires. Their lanterns cast dancing shadows across the churned earth as they searched the drainage ditches. They found the captain's horse, first a magnificent black stallion, still fully saddled, standing motionless in the darkness. Its eyes rolled white with terror when they approached, and no amount of coaxing could calm it. The beast's saddle was slick with blood, yet bore no bullet holes. In his official report later that night, Harrow noted the horse's regimental markings matched those of the 4th Cuirassiers. The saddle bore the name Dubois stamped into the leather. But what truly chilled him was the logbook entry he discovered while checking the unit's records. Captain Henry Dubois had indeed commanded the 2nd Squadron. but according to the morning's muster roll, he had been present for duty at dawn, his signature clear and precise on the document. The signature was dated June 18th, 1815. The same day Harrow had watched him die. The same day he had continued to fight without his head. As Harrow finished his report, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed across the battlefield. When he looked up, the captain's horse was gone, leaving only bloodied hoofprints that led nowhere. 2 days after the battle, Harrow sat in his tent, surrounded by maps and reports, searching for any rational explanation for what he'd witnessed. His shoulder wound burned with an unnatural cold, its edges too clean, as if cut by a blade of frost rather than steel. The surgeon had been baffled, muttering about wounds that wouldn't heal and flesh that felt like ice. The first sign something was wrong came at sunset. Through the evening mist, sentries reported seeing a mounted figure in a French uniform standing motionless atop a distant ridge. For 3 hours it remained there, perfectly still, its absent head silhouetted against the dying light. When a patrol investigated, they found only a sword planted upright in the mud, its blade coated in rime despite the summer heat. Later that night, a messenger brought captured French documents. Among them, Harrow discovered a battlefield map marked with unit positions. His hands trembled as he recognized the handwriting Captain Dubois' precise script, but dated hours after his death. In the margins, written in what looked disturbingly like dried blood, "Il Church sa terre." He seeks his head. The drainage ditches where witnesses claimed the head had rolled formed a pattern when viewed from above, converging near La Haye Saint Farm. As Harrow studied the map, hoofbeats approached his tent measured, deliberate. But when he looked outside, he saw something far worse than phantom tracks. The headless captain sat mounted in the darkness, 30 yards away, completely motionless. His sword hung at his side, undrawn. For a long moment, he simply watched. The very act of being observed by something without eyes drove 2 sentries to hysterics. They were still screaming when the Prussian officer burst in with news of Weber's death. Found in his tent, the officer reported grimly. His throat, torn, as if something had tried to pull his head off. No footprints, but we found this. He placed a scrap of blue fabric on Harrow's desk, a cuirassier's uniform piece, gold braids still gleaming through the mud. When Harrow looked back outside, the phantom rider was gone. But he had left a message carved into the bark of a nearby tree, a crude map matching the drainage ditch pattern, drawn by a sword tip caked in frozen blood. In the distance, a horse screamed. 3 nights after Weber's death, a storm rolled in from the north. Lightning illuminated the battlefield in stuttering flashes, revealing the grotesque shadows of half-buried corpses and broken war machines. Harrow gathered with a group of officers in the command tent, their faces haunted in the flickering lamplight as they reviewed the day's reports. Major Harrison was speaking about supply logistics when the first hoofbeats cut through the storm's rumble. This time, they were different, not the solitary phantom sounds that had haunted Harrow's nights, but the measured stride of a military formation. "Do you hear that?" Harrow interrupted, his voice tight. The other officers fell silent, listening. The hoofbeats grew louder, more distinct. A sentry's horn blared in alarm, then cut off with a wet, choking sound. The lanterns dimmed as if something was drawing the light from them. Through the canvas walls, they could see a mounted figure pass by the silhouette unmistakable in its wrongness. Where a head should have been, there was only empty air, yet the body sat perfectly straight in the saddle. "Dear God," Harrison whispered, reaching for his pistol. "It's just like the men reported, the headless French captain." A gurgling sound filled the air, like a man trying to speak through a severed throat. The temperature plummeted until their breath frosted in the air. Outside, more hoofbeats joined the first, an entire phantom squadron materializing from the storm. Lieutenant Dubois burst into the tent, his wounded arm still in its sling, his face wild with terror. "He's found them," the Frenchman cried. "The drainage ditches, they weren't random. They formed a map, a path to the others. Others? Harrow demanded, but he already knew. The pattern he'd seen in the battlefield map, the convergence point near La Haye Sainte. The heads, Dubois choked out. All the heads taken by cannon fire that day. My brother, he's collecting them, searching, but they're not his. None of them are his. The canvas wall behind them ripped open. A cold wind howled through the tent, extinguishing the lanterns. In the darkness, they heard the slow creak of leather saddles, the clink of cavalry spurs, the wet sound of blood dripping on canvas. When lightning flashed again, they saw him clearly, Captain Dubois astride his midnight stallion, his headless body still wearing its blood-stained cuirassier uniform. For those unfamiliar with French cavalry, the cuirass was a gleaming steel breastplate that marked the elite heavy cavalry, making them nearly invincible to all but the heaviest weapons. Now that same armor bore the telltale impact mark of a 12-pound cannonball just below the collar. His sword arm raised in a perfect cavalry salute, acknowledging his living brother before pointing the blade toward the distant drainage ditches. The message was clear. He would not stop until he found what was taken from him, and anyone who stood in his way would join his grim harvest. Dawn found Harrow and a hand-picked team of soldiers trudging through the rain-soaked drainage ditches near La Haye Sainte. Lieutenant Dubois led them, his good arm clutching a detailed map of the water channels. Every man carried a loaded musket, though the previous night's encounter had proven conventional weapons useless against their supernatural foe. The water flow changed during the battle, Dubois explained, his voice hoarse. The cannon fire destroyed the original drainage patterns, when thousands of men and horses. He swallowed hard. When they fell, their blood altered the channels, created new paths. They reached a point where several ditches converged. The morning mist clung to the ground like a burial shroud, and the air carried the metallic tang of old blood. Here, the earth had been churned by particularly heavy fighting the final stand of the French Imperial Guard. One of the engineers, Sergeant Mills, knelt to examine the soil. "Sir," he called out, his voice wavering, "there's something here." His spade struck something solid, producing a sound like cracked pottery. They began to dig, revealing a grotesque collection, dozens of heads, claimed by cannon fire during the battle's height, gathered by the water's flow into this makeshift charnel pit. But none belonged to Captain Dubois. A horse whinnied in the distance. The sound carried an unnatural echo, as if coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "He's coming," Lieutenant Dubois whispered, backing away from the pit. "My brother, he knows we're here," disturbing his search. The mist began to swirl, forming shapes that resembled mounted cavalrymen. The temperature plummeted until frost crackled across their uniforms. Through the fog, they heard the measured hoofbeats of the Phantom Squadron. "Form square," Harrow ordered, falling back on military doctrine, even as his mind screamed at the futility. The men complied, their training overriding their terror. The headless captain emerged from the mist, his phantom cavalry forming up behind him. His sword raised in an elegant salute that somehow carried more menace than mercy. The gurgling sound filled the air again, that horrible attempt at speech through his severed throat. Lieutenant Dubois stepped forward, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Brother, please," he begged. "Your head isn't here. We've looked. You must rest." The phantom rider's sword lowered, pointing directly at his brother's throat. The message was clear: either help him find what was taken, or join his headless ranks. One of the soldiers, driven mad by fear, broke ranks and ran. The captain's blade flashed once in the gray morning light. The man's head struck the frozen ground before his body crumpled. They had tried to end this horror. They had failed. And now, as the Phantom Squadron closed in around them, Harrow realized with mounting dread that they would become part of it. Harrow's last official report never appeared in the military records of the Battle of Waterloo. His personal journal, however, survived, discovered decades later in a Belgian farmhouse. its pages filled with increasingly frantic entries that ended abruptly in July 1815. The final page, written in a shaking hand, reads, "He will ride until he finds his head. May God help the poor soul who stands in his way. The drainage ditches hold their secrets, but not the one he seeks. I understand now the head was never here. The boy, the young cannoneer who loaded that fatal shot in his panic heat." The rest of the entry trails off into an illegible scrawl, but a marginal note adds, "The boy took it as a trophy. Artillery crews compete for confirmed kills. He wanted proof he'd struck an officer. Fled north after the battle toward Antwerp, carrying his grim prize. God forgive him. He knows not what he's awakened." What is known is this. In the days following that last entry, 3 more soldiers were found dead, their heads torn from their bodies. Lieutenant Dubois disappeared entirely, though his bloodied uniform was discovered near the old sunken road, the buttons carved with his unit insignia still gleaming. A scrap of paper in the pocket contained a final message in his hand. "Forgive me, Mother. I must follow Henry. He needs me to find his way home." The British Army's official casualty reports from Waterloo contain a curious footnote about the 4th Cuirassiers. While Captain Henry Dubois is listed among the dead, his body was never officially recovered. More striking still is the addendum, written by a clerk who catalogued recovered equipment. 1 cuirass, heavily damaged, missing head-mounting bracket. Rider's identity confirmed by unit markings. Note: blood patterns inconsistent with recorded cause of death. Years passed. The battlefield became farmland again. But the horror wasn't finished. In 1852, a Belgian farmer named Joseph Van Dam was plowing a field near the old position of La Haye Sainte when his blade struck metal. What he unearthed chilled him to the bone a French cuirassier's armor, still strapped to a skeletal body. The skull was missing, but the uniform scraps bore the rank insignia of a captain. The discovery might have remained a mere curiosity of war, except for what happened next. That night, Van Dam reported hearing hoofbeats approaching his farm. When he looked out his window, he saw a figure on horseback in the moonlight, a French cavalry officer, sitting impossibly straight in his saddle, his uniform pristine despite the decades of burial. Where his head should have been, there was only empty air. The hoofbeats continued north, following the old road that led to Antwerp. Legend says that's where the young French cannoneer fled after the battle, taking with him a terrible secret and an even more terrible trophy. To this day, on nights when the fog rolls thick across the Belgian countryside, farmers sometimes report hearing phantom hoofbeats in the distance. The sound grows closer and closer, accompanied by a wet, gurgling attempt at speech, as if something is trying to cry out through a severed throat. He still rides, they say, still searches, and he will never stop until he finds what was taken from him. Some wounds, it seems, not even death can heal. Some soldiers never surrender, not even to death itself. If this tale from the War Maestro's Archive has stirred something in your military soul, consider joining our ranks. Listen carefully for phantom hoofbeats, and when you hear them approaching, hit that subscribe button. You'll want to be prepared when our next dark chapter unfolds. Activate the notification bell. After all, vigilance is a soldier's best defense against what lurks in the battlefield's shadows. Share this account with those who understand that some war stories can never be found in official records. And leave a comment below. Have you ever encountered something on watch that defied explanation? Or perhaps you've heard whispers of other units who've faced the unexplainable in the field. Remember, every battlefield holds its secrets, and some of them are still searching for what they've lost.